Hello, my name is Rob Garner. I'm a computer programming instructor, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to use Visual Studio Online to do the Agile development planning workflow. So we're going to assume that you already have a group project created for Visual Studio. And in this case, it's my game dev course project, which I'm going to use. And we're going to start off with defining user stories. So in order to define user stories, we're going to open up our project, which brings you to this page. And I'm going to click on work. And what the work page provides you is the capability to define your user stories, associate them with your iterations, and then add tasks associated with each of your user stories. So a user story is a very general description of some measurable piece of functionality. And typically the format is as a, I would like to, in order to. And we're going to add user stories by selecting our backlog. You can actually do them from the board as well, but I tend to like using this. And let's say we're making a computer game, and we're going to say, as a player, I would like to see a splash screen in order to see something interesting / exciting about the game. So we can add user stories like this, and we might have some other user stories. As a player, I would like to see a startup GUI so that I can start a training level, start a campaign, or quit the game. And we would just keep writing and creating user stories that we want to implement. And typically this will come out of some kind of requirements document, and we don't want these user stories to be too detailed. We just want them to generally describe a usable unit of work, something that can be tested. So for example, a splash screen, I can test that by looking at by creating a splash screen. Maybe a focus group might look at the graphics of that splash screen and provide us feedback. The startup GUI, I can pretty easily determine if the GUI shows up and if the player can click on buttons and go to different levels. So these are individual units of work, and these are individual units of value, really, in the application. And there's kind of an art to developing your user stories so that when I go to implement these, I have something testable and usable, but it's not so large that it should that it should take too much work at one time to implement. So it's the minimum usable level. It's a minimum usable amount of functionality that creates some level of value. And we don't want to be too detailed here either. We will leave developing the individual tasks that need to implement this and the really more detailed specification of what this is to the iteration where they get implemented. So typically, user stories are something that at the beginning of a project, you might define a large number of user stories and put them in your backlog like they are here. And over time, you may keep adding to your backlog, and you'll wait to add them to an iteration until you start planning for that iteration. Once it comes time to plan an iteration, let's say we're going to start iteration 1, we might pick one or two or just a few iterations, and we can click and drag them into the iteration. And if we look at the iteration, once I dragged it there, we see that that user story from the backlog was brought into the iteration. And so I'm going to go back to my backlog, and let's say we're going to do the splash screen and the GUI, and that's all we want for iteration 1. So I go to iteration 1 after I drag them, and I can see them here. Now I can add tasks by clicking on here and adding a task, but at this stage I kind of like going to the board, and what the board provides me is a more visual depiction of my user stories. And if I want to add a task, I can click on here and add a task. And so, for example, for this GUI, developing the graphic that's going to be the background, and odds are if I have an artist on my team, they're the ones who are going to get this task. And maybe another task is create a scene in Unity for the splash screen. And just generally go down and define what do we need to do to make this this happen. That's probably enough. I'm probably going to assign a programmer to do this. I kind of want these tasks to be not too large. I want them to be maybe a 2-hour activity or a 4-hour activity. At most, maybe an 8-hour activity. Because what I want to be able to see is once they complete a piece of work, that it moves over to active and then resolved. And so, for example, maybe I'm going to assign this to myself, and once I sign a task, it will then be dragged over to active, because then I'm assigned the task to work on it. And there's a couple ways we can do this. One approach that the teams can use is after iteration planning and the tasks have been defined, the team as a whole can volunteer to grab individual tasks, and then at that point you would go ahead and assign them and bring them over. Other teams will work by basically defining the tasks, and then as developers have time complete a task, they will go in, see what's in the task list, and they will take the tasks and assign them to themselves and move them over. If you have a particularly young team, you might actually have the team leader do that. There's probably thousands of pages of information on the internet about what is the right and wrong way of doing that. For purposes of this tutorial, I am trying to be rather agnostic on what's the best approach and base it more on what I've seen different teams do. So pick the approach that works best for your team. In my case, I kind of like the idea of having a discussion during the iteration planning meeting, and if people are particularly taken with doing a task, let them go ahead and take it. And so you would define your tasks. And so, for example, as player, I'd like to see a startup GUI. So creating the GUI itself, and maybe the buttons could be defined as individual tasks, depending on how much granularity you want on your workflow. This may be too small. Getting down to the individual control level might be a little bit too detailed. On the other hand, This might work because this is somewhat dependent on there being a training level, and so there might be some dependent things that you're lining up. Maybe what this really says is this task really should be stub out a training level and then create a button. There's some art to how you design these. So once we have our tasks and then we bring them over, then what you can do in Visual Studio is as you complete tasks and you do a check-in, you can actually associate those tasks with those check-ins with the task. You'll see them show up in your team view. And for the sake of illustration, I've created a little console application that's just going to write out splash. And once I have whatever functionality I've created in my program, I would, if this is the first time this project was being associated with version control, you would go through the following steps. So I'd add the solution to source control, associate it with the project. And then I would, then when you check in, you can actually add a work item by ID. So once we go to Team Explorer in Visual Studio, we can add a work item by ID. And to find the work item number, probably the easiest way is to just go to your board, double click on the task, and you'll see it up here in the corner, 325. This menu can also be used, or this dialog can also be used to update status. You can actually come back in here and retroactively associate or items with check-ins. But it's probably best to be in the habit of associating them as you do the check-in. So that's 325. And I'm going to put 325 in my related work items. And when I add it, I see that it shows up here. And I'm going to make sure that I set it as resolved. If you're doing some interim check-ins and they don't actually resolve the work item, you can actually just put associate. But this one will say that's all we wanted. Just that. And I put in my check-in comment. And so now I've got a change. It's going to be create splash screen. I click check-in. And this should change the status of that task in here. If I refresh, I can see that this actually went to closed. It should just be in resolved. So I'm going to make it active again. And move it to resolved. I guess it's going to be determined to be closed. So if we look at this task, we can see that the change set is marked here now in the task. So it tells us what was done to implement it. You can actually double click on it and it shows you which file was modified. You can even look get that in Visual Studio. And it'll show you what the changes were. So that's a summary of how to use Visual Studio Online to manage tasks. Other ways that you can complete tasks are simply dragging them over, and that might be useful if you have, say, someone who's not using Visual Studio Online and what they're doing is maybe checking assets into a Dropbox folder. They could just come to Visual Studio Online and just move their tasks along to whichever folder they need to bring it to. In addition to tasks, you can also put in bugs. And use it for bug reporting. And as you complete and resolve bugs, they can be moved from one location to the other. So that concludes my introduction to using Visual Studio Online and its iteration or in its agile planning software. Thank you very much.